know we've chatted at Sportsman's Club, among other things, that your dad or family had some sort of contact with Jackson, and I've never really captured that moment. What was that thing? They play cards together?
Well, my dad was a little older than Jackson, but he was like, when was Jackson born?
1892.
Yeah, Dad was 1886.
Oh, wow.
But they were contemporaries, young people in Jamestown making their way in the world. My dad was an engineer. He ran the, well, not in those days, but he worked for the Board of Public Utilities in those days. Actually ran the water department, as your brother did for many years, yeah. But he and Jackson were fishing buddies. They were trout fishing pals, and they went up to Canada with a group of men, including Sam Price's dad and Willard Cass's uncle and a whole bunch of these guys. And they'd go up in some remote place in Ontario and fish for a couple weeks every year. And then they were part of the Sportsman's Club together and probably played cards. I don't know about that, but had a few cocktails, I'm sure, and probably swapped a lot of lies, especially about fishing.
Do you recall any conversation about your dad talking about Jackson as a guy or anything else other than?
Not much. The only thing I remember as a kid was my dad was an honorary bearer at his funeral. And, you know, I was, what was that, 54?
54?
54. I was 12 years old. I wasn't paying a lot of attention to the Supreme Court in those days. I just knew there was this big guy, and my dad was involved in his funeral, and he was, well, along with about 49 other people or something like that, as I recall. But, you know, then I talked to him maybe in the early 70s. He died in 76. Just casually mentioned it. I think somebody brought a board or something that was on the wall up at the Sportsman's Club one time, and I asked Dad about him, and there was a picture of them, I think, fishing in Canada, and he said, that's Jackson, and that's, pointed out all these guys. But he didn't talk much about his past.
Did your mother, was she a home mother, or she have an occupation?
Well, she worked for, I don't know, 15, 18 years before they married. They were not young. Dad was in his 50s, and she was 38, I think, or something. She was 38 when I was born, I guess, so she was probably 36 when they got married. She worked for a stockbroker, Goodbody and Company, and went to New York and actually worked as a young single woman with another gal from Jamestown, shared an apartment, did the Broadway shows and all that stuff, and she got a taste of the Big Apple. And then I think in the Depression, she told me her boss jumped out of a window down there, and that was the end of that job. And she came home and ended up at City Hall, where my dad went back in the 30s. He went in the war, went in the First World War in the Navy, came back. His father died. He took over a clothing store that his father had, a real high-end men's clothing store down on Main Street, and then discovered his father, who was a serial entrepreneur, was also a serial debt builder, and so Dad spent years paying off all of his debts, as he did in those days. Nowadays, you just declare him bankrupt and let somebody else worry about it, but he did that. So he never married until late, I think 1940 or something like that. And then he went back to work for the city and ran the Board of Public Utilities, built the new steam generating plant there on Steel Street in the late 40s, early 50s. Oh, he retired the day I started high school. He had forced retirement, 70. Yeah. So it was weird. Then he came to work here. Then he started his own professional engineering firm, one man, basically, and he became the consulting engineer for Chautauqua Institution and a couple of other businesses, manufacturers in Jamestown.
So your first introduction to Chautauqua Institution would have been through your dad's employment here?
Well, he actually used to rent a cottage down the lake at Woodlawn every year for the month of August. My dad was a big muskie fisherman, and that's when the muskie season sort of kicks off. So we stayed at a little cottage down there. And we used to come up, well, when I was older in high school, we used to sneak in by boat, come up here and, you know, land down on the waterfront. Later on, when I was a little older, we used to climb the fence and come in on Wednesday nights thinking we were going to pick up chicks around the amphitheater. That was the Pops concert. And so some of my buddies, we'd cruise the amp thinking this was going to be a really good deal. It never worked out.
So what do you think the treasurer of Chautauqua thought of guys like you at that time?
probably thought he liked to nail us. You know, it was Jerry Lynch who actually got nailed himself and went to jail for a while, I guess. But I caddied for him up here at the golf course. He was a champion golfer, and I don't know how the hell he did it. You know, how do you have this job and be a zero handicap, scratch handicap golfer, win the county golf championship year after year, Moonbrook, Chautauqua Golf Club, and in the wintertime, work as a tax preparer for your auditor?
You see a conflict there, though?
No, I don't know. But he did get busted for putting his hand in the till.
So you're a graduate of Jamestown High School, class of
59,
59?
Michigan, 63.
Why Michigan, by the way?
My dad went there, and he introduced my brother and I to Michigan along. See, we came from a mixed marriage. My mother was very Irish Catholic. My father was Lutheran, Swedish Lutheran, but non-participating. So there was always this conflict. Got to go to a Catholic school, you lose your religion. You go to a public school, you know, and so forth. Well, she was right. That's what happened. But I looked at
You lost your religion in Michigan?
Well, it was later, but you know, it was the beginning of it. Yeah, became what we call a backslider. And but I looked at Villanova, Boston College, Penn State, and Michigan, and he took us to a football game when I was 8th grade, I think, and never, thought nothing like it. Big house. The big house wasn't so big then, but was pretty impressive to an 8th grader.
So what did you study there? What was your accounting?
No, econ.
Yeah.
You know, good times, econ. I was in the Navy ROTC, so I spent summers on Navy cruises. Went directly in the Navy, commissioned the same day I graduated, and did actually almost 7 years active.
Where were you based?
I started out on an oiler in Newport, Rhode Island. Spent a couple years at sea, mostly at sea on that thing, and then went to Indian Head, Maryland, where there's a naval propellant plant and ordnance station. I was an assistant supply officer there, and then I went to the Philippines to the Naval Air Station, QB Point, where I was assistant supply officer at a pretty big operation for about 2.5 years.
So you're in the Navy. This is 1963 or so.
63 to 70.
And Cold War. What was the sense of the Navy at the time? I mean, there was a lot going on vis-a-vis the Russian arsenal buildup.
Well, my late Navy experience was all about the Vietnam War. You know, we were supporting the aircraft carriers and the air wings that were flying, dropping stuff off North Vietnam and in Vietnam. So mostly my relationship was that. And the other places, Naval Ordnance Station, we built rockets, or built the propellant systems for rockets. Everything from the Atlas, which was huge, to Sidewinder, which you could put in your pocket practically, and did a lot of that. We had about 3,500 civilian employees and about 120 military, I think, down there. Plus, the Naval Ordnance Station was there, where they trained the frogmen for the underwater bomb disposal. So that was part of it, and so there was a sense that there was some build-up going on down there with that. I was a contracting officer. And God, only the military could give a kid who was, I think, probably 24, 25, I think I had $10 million purchasing authority. If it was above $10 million, I had to get somebody above me. What the hell is that all about? I mean, geez. Fortunately, there were some civilians there that had been in the game for many, many years, and I think, smart enough to rely on them but I was the guy on the signature panel for all those things. It was interesting because I was buying chemicals from Hercules Powder Company and one of the companies out of Niagara Falls. And I was surprised at the political interest in military contracting. I mean, I was appalled, actually. There was a representative, Daniel Flood, who basically threatened me out of Pennsylvania, and their company down there, I think that was Hercules maybe, was not the low bidder on this contract. And I got a call from the congressman's office and finally from the congressman himself, basically threatening my commission and blah, 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 if we didn't give the contract to that company. Well, we didn't, and nothing happened, but that's the way things happened, I guess, in those days.
So when you're listening to Congressman Flood and he's giving you this tirade, or this encouragement, I shouldn't say tirade, encouragement to do that, and you hang up the phone, what's your first reaction?
Oh, shit. Run in and talk to the commander and say, Commander, I think I really screwed up. And he was great. I mean, he was this big Irish guy named Finn, and he said, did the right thing, son. I'm with you.
How else did it manifest itself? I mean, calls from congressmen, was there a lot of that throughout the system?
I don't think so. I mean, that was my only experience with that. But, you know, it was a wake-up call, you know, reality of the economic situation, the military-industrial complex.
So this is, again, late 60s, through 1970. This is Vietnam at its public relations worst. And Lyndon Johnson not going to run again. What was the morale like in the Navy?
Well, it went down. I went there in January 68. I think the Tet Offensive was in January of 68. And of course, the buildup was incredible, where we used to see one aircraft carrier a month. We'd see two, maybe three sometimes, coming and going, you know, through our base. And then as the losses started piling up, and as it became evident that Westmoreland was, you know, fudging the numbers, and those guys, those of us that were not career officers, were pretty down about the whole thing. In fact, I was really close friends with one of Ralph's buddies from medical school, Don Wells.
Oh, Jim, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. He was a psychiatrist stationed at the Naval Hospital,
Yeah,
and there was a
faculty with me at Rochester.
Yeah, okay, and yeah, so because I met Ralph about the day he got here. Don says you got to meet this guy, and what was that, about 1971, 70?
1976.
76. But anyway, the gang of us were all short timers. I mean, they wouldn't let me out. I made the mistake of staying in an extra 6 months because my then wife had a bun in the oven, and I figured the Navy engendered this, they might as well give birth to it. And so, and he was born at the Naval Hospital. I took her to the Naval Hospital, went over to the Bureau of Personnel, and turned in my resignation, and this guy says to me, Lieutenant, didn't you hear the news? And I said, what's that? He says, the President of the United States has extended all regular officers for at least a year. And I said, what? I said, when? He said, yesterday. What are my options? He said, well, come back in a couple of days. So I went over to the hospital and got the new baby into the world. And a couple of days later, I went back, and he said, well, you can go to Vietnam for a year. I said, no, I don't think that's a good idea. Now I had two little guys, and you go to someplace in Alaska that, you know, had 12 people on the base, someplace in the Bahamas, which sounded really good, or go to the Philippines. So I checked with a guy at the base that had been at this Eleuthera in the Bahamas. He says, you'll be nuts in 6 months. He said that there's 220 people, of which 22 are officers. There's nothing to do, you know, except drink, play tennis, and scuba dive. And he said, don't go there. He said, I almost lost my mind there. So I went to the Philippines, where I had an uncle that was a missionary priest. And he'd been back and forth, so I had some familiarity with the culture and, you know, some interest in the family. It turned out to be a great tour, great, fabulous people, wonderful people, interesting country, and I got to travel throughout a lot of the Far East, thanks to the Navy and the Air Force.
How long were you there then in the Philippines?
About 2.5 years.
What was your role there?
I was Assistant Aviation Supply Officer. I had warehouses, a motor pool, a liquid oxygen plant, a fuel farm. Had about, I don't know, 110 sailors working for me, I guess. And we had a big division because we were the reason for the base, basically, the supply of the carriers and the air wings that were flying off the carriers.
So you get mustered out from the Navy. Now, did you have a sense of your career path?
No, I knew I had that background as purchasing officer, so I thought, well, there's a place to start. So as I sent resumes out, I went in that direction. And then, you know, when I got back in the States, I came back, I think in April or May of that year, went to they used to have job fairs for displaced, well, we weren't displaced, I voluntarily left, but for officers coming out, there was companies that did this, it was a big deal. And so I found a couple of opportunities in the Midwest, and I thought I wanted to go to New England. And so I came back here to see my folks, who were still well and living in Jamestown. And of course my dad, who had been involved in the community for his whole lifetime, had, unbeknownst to me, a bunch of interviews set up, including, ironically, one with Reggie Linnae at Blackstone. What am I doing now? Basically working for Reggie Linnae. And a couple of other things. And my old high school buddy, Stan Lundeen, had just been elected mayor of Jamestown the previous fall. And he found out I was in town and said, come on down to City Hall. Well, the next thing you know, I got an offer at City Hall to be something at the Board of Public Utilities, where my father had worked for 27 years, but he had retired in 1956. This is 1970. So I went to work there because Stan was the mayor, my friend Chuck Hall was the controller, Steve Carlson was the city clerk. So we were all guys that were in high school together, and you know, we thought it'd be kind of fun to try to turn this old industrial city around a little bit. And it was. And then a few years hence, Hall went to law school, and Stan asked me to be finance director, which I served as for about 7 years. And that's how I got here, because the auditor for the city was Miles Lasser, and one day he called me over to his office. I got to see you right away. And I thought, oh shit, I'm up a creek. They found something, you know, and would you ever consider leaving the city? I said, what for? Chautauqua Institution. Huh? What's the job? Treasurer. I said, Miles, that's my dream job. But I figured I'd do that the last 5 years of my working life. It's a little early. I was 38 or 39. And he said, well, just go up and talk to Hess. And I'd never met Bob Hess. So one Saturday, I think it was the last Saturday of the season, I came up and met Bob Hess in his office and had a great discussion. And he said, would you consider coming here? And I said, well, I don't know. I said, I hear you're a real son of a bitch. And he said, you do? I said, yeah, that's the word on the street in Jamestown. That's what everybody says about you. Really? I don't think I am. Well, come back in a couple of weeks and we'll talk. So we talked all that fall, off and on. And the more he talked, and the more I talked to him, I realized that the guy was the real thing. And if he was going to be an SOB, he wasn't going to be an SOB to me. And that's how I got here. And
at that time period, was there a real town and gown relationship between Chautauqua and inside the gates and outside the gates? Did you get a sense of that?
oh yeah, there wasn't much communication. A few of the staff, you know, were involved in the community, but you know, Bob, I don't know how they could call him an SOB. Nobody would have known him. I mean, he had no presence in Jamestown. I'd show up once a year for a, you know, talking dog and pony show, ask for money or ask for, you know, ticket sales. I don't even know if he did that before I got there. Most of the people were either lived here or lived somewhere up here, and they just weren't, I mean, I didn't know any of the senior staff except, I guess, I had just met Dick Reddington. He'd been hired about 6 months before that. He was the only one I think I knew. Zimmer, I guess, Phil Zimmer, I guess I did know a little bit. But yeah, there was not much. And Oscar Remick was never a presence in the community. You know, he'd preached down at First Pres once in a while, but other than that, he wasn't around. And the treasurer's Marshall, he lived up here. I don't think he ever went to town. Yeah, I don't think so. There was a whole different thing. And when I came in, Bob said, I want to open Jamestown up and get more involved. And that was part of my job, was to introduce Jamestown to Chautauqua and vice versa. We had a few board members at the time, Barger and Don Pembridge, but I don't think they really spread the word a lot. I think it was more of a prestige thing, you know, to be on the board up here, and I don't think it related much to Jamestown and their life down there.
What was the economic condition of this place at the time?
Oh, it was wretched. They'd had a series of bad years, and then they had that Gebby Challenge where they had to meet, I think they had to break even, you know, 5 years in a row, or at the end of 5 years have achieved a certain point. And I think they cheated like hell to make that work, and on the book side of it. The computerization was Marshall was very reluctant to get into computers. He didn't understand them, he didn't want to understand them, and he didn't push it hard. They had a basic program, but it was terrible and very, very awkward to use. So my first job was to bring a modern IBM system in here and convert the accounting to that. I hired a guy named Ken Aiken, who after 3 months, I think, he came and helped, and he was the best thing that I ever did, really. I mean, he was smart, nose to the grindstone, detail. I wasn't an accountant. He was an accountant. You know, he'd been an accountant for a company, AVM in Jamestown, and I never pretended to be an accountant. I was a financial manager guy. I understood budgets and presentations and all that stuff. I could read a balance sheet. I understood it, but I didn't. I hated the, you know, long row of numbers, add them up. That part I didn't like. I had to do it with a budget until we got the damn thing on the computer. But Ken, he was really good at that. So we got the thing set up, and then we put some disciplines in and made money.
What was your role? I mean, if you had to describe what it is that you initially, when you came here with Bob Hess, you know, your job description, and I realized what the title was, treasurer, but what did that really mean?
Well, one of the things that one of the other staff said to me, or maybe it was Bob Hess, I guess it was Bob Hess, he said, one of the tricks to Chautauqua is it's got a lot of tradition, it's got a lot of people that have been around for a long time, and you got to figure out how to manage the place without acting like you're managing it. You know, and part of my role was to try to bring in some fiscal discipline, financial discipline, without being like a controller at Marlin Rock or at SKF in Jamestown and, you know, kicking people out the door and cutting salaries and doing that sort of thing. You couldn't do it. So part of it was just to try to cajole people into respecting the budget. Part of it was respecting donors' money. I never had a sense that they really paid much attention to where that money came from, and there was a lot of money spent on us. I remember when I first came here going to lunch over at the Bark Grill on Fridays, and the institution was picking up the tab. What the hell is this? This is just us chickens, you know. We shouldn't be buying ourselves lunch. Well, Hess was pretty good about, you know, he liked to live on the high side. There's a great story about Hess. He went to, he told it on himself. He went out to Chicago to make a development call on somebody that I don't know who it was, never knew who it was, I guess. But they lived in Lake Forest and, you know, pretty nice circumstances. He pulls up in front of the house in the car that he got at the airport. Well, goes to the airport to get a regular car, and they upgraded him to a Cadillac. Pulls up, parks in front of the house, doorbell. Guy answers the door. Oh, hi, Dr. Hess, nice to see you. How'd you get here? I drove. Oh, you drove that car? Yeah. Chautauqua doesn't need my money. Close the door on him. I think Bob got a little humility after that, but there was still a lot of high living on the, and so part of it was to say, look, this isn't our money. Somebody else made this money and gave it to us to steward and, you know, use it for programs and physical facilities and stuff like that. So part of it was just that. Another part was to be able to take a lot of flack from different sources, including the unions. We had, well, I don't know, actually we had about 7 or 8 unions. We probably still have 7 or 8 unions, but we had about 3 of them that were pretty difficult. The musicians union, I think to this day, is probably pretty tough. The stagehands union in those days was tough. And I think the American Guild of Musical Artists, which was the opera singers, and to try to beat those people into some sense of reality, because they'd given away the store and then they got real tight one year, and Hess was going to throw the orchestra out and bring in the Pittsburgh Symphony or something if they didn't agree to a contract. So the relationships were really sour. Well, they did get a little bit of a control, but then after that, it opened up again. And so, dealing with those guys, taking the flack, was all part of the deal. But I got hardened a little bit at City Hall, dealing with those unions.
So you were on the front line, as I recall. You were the negotiator.
Yeah, I did them all. MT and I did orchestra together sometimes. Marty and I. Marty probably still does it.
Do you, did you get involved in programming at all?
Yeah, that was one of the neat things about Hess, and more so even with Dan Bratton. If you had an interest in something, especially I'm talking about the lecture platform, if there were areas that you had a personal interest in, I was interested in the environment, foreign affairs, political events and stuff like that. So I got included in a lot of the planning for those weeks when we did weeks that included any of that. And that was a lot of fun, and I'd identify potential lecturers and whatnot. There were 2 years where I actually did most of the special programming, because one year Mary Therese Menino, who was the programming director, had a heart attack in the middle of the winter, and I had to do that season. And I was just talking to Marty this afternoon. I stopped in to see him and reminded both of us that I did most of the program the year he came, which was 91. So I think I did 87 or 88 and 91 for the specials. And that was really interesting because I got a sense of what that world is like, and that's not pretty. People that represent those acts are not a lot of fun to deal with. They're not the kind of people that'll tell you something and you can take it to the bank very often.
Give us a little vignette or two along those lines. And the good news, statute of limitations is run, so whatever you say is of no consequence.
Oh, God. Peter, Paul, and Mary had a agent named Marcia Hirschberger. And we wanted Peter, Paul, and Mary. I don't know if they'd ever been here up to that point. And I held a spot for them for one whole year, one whole off season, one of those years. Date. And right up to like June 15th or something, a week before the season, 2 weeks before the season, before they said, no, I'm sorry, we're going to Art Park. They made a bigger offer. Now, I was stupid to, let it go that long, and we filled it. But after that, the next time I did it, and for many years in senior staff, I said, do not deal with those people. I don't care how nice they are and how idealistic they are, and, if I had a hammer and all that stuff. But they're agents, a lying SOB, and I wouldn't deal with them. We ended up with a guy named Phil Citron, who I just found out today is very sick, and he cut through the BS and really was able to find the right, not always the right acts, because it's hard to find an act for this place. Can't charge enough, can't sell enough tickets, can't compete with the Indians, the casinos. But I didn't have that casino problem back then. But once we got lined up with Phil, who had been an agent for one of the big ones like ICM, or I forget what the other one was, and then went off on his own. He was sort of an agent for an agent, so in a way you were paying a little too much, but on the other hand, you got what he said you were going to get. And when he said you got the act, put it on the calendar. I mean, it's there. And I don't think he ever lost an act. The only two, Johnny Cash, we didn't learn that lesson either. Johnny Cash stiffed us I think he got busted in Chicago or something for some kind of drug activity or some damn thing. And we got the call about 10 o'clock on a Friday. He was going to be here that night, 10 o'clock on Friday. So I remember scrambling that day trying to find a replacement act. And I called a friend of mine in Jamestown, had a bar, and I said, can you get me a cowboy warm-up act? You know, we had to have somebody, because we knew whatever was going to happen, we're probably going to get somebody here late. Wasn't going to start at 8:15 or whatever the time was. So this guy, he found a warm-up act, and it was Marshall Dillon. Remember, he used to have that bar over there on Fluvanna?
Dale Marshall?
Dale Marshall. I still see him once in a while. We laugh about this. And then we finally, Porter Wagner. We ended up with Porter Wagner. And he was he was going off a tour, and he was going on vacation. And somehow we were able to line him up. How are we going to get him? I called my friend Joel Hall, who had the local airport, or the local airline. He hooked me up with a chartered jet service. Called them, and they say, yeah, we just had a cancellation. Some country in Western Singer was going. So they diverted that plane from Chicago to Nashville, picked up Porter Wagner. And I'm up at the airport at, what time? Did you go with me, Jan, to that? I went up there with a pocket full of cash, $15,000 to pay Porter Wagner in cash, because he didn't know Chautauqua from beans. And the airline, or the charter jet, had to be paid in cash, $3,500 cash on the wing of the airplane. Drive him, Porter, up here, and did a great job, you know, and saved the day. And Johnny Cash did it to us again about 2 years later, because his agent kept saying, we owe him a date, we owe you a date, we owe you a date. He's dried out, he's straightened out, he's going to be there. Same thing happened, but we had 24 hours notice that time. And I forget who we got, but I remember being called, Joe Johnson, come backstage. Joe Johnson, the amphitheater, come backstage. No acts going on. You know, it's 8:30, 8:35, 8:40. We had one of these mixed combo Western acts. It was bluegrass. It was Bill Monroe, who was supposedly the father of bluegrass, and who the hell was the other one? I forget. And they'd been touring together, and they'd had a fight the night before wherever they'd played in Cleveland or somewhere like that. Had a big fight, and they wouldn't talk to each other. And the money was all in one pot to go by check to the promoter who was traveling with them, and they were, I don't know what the split was. Well, they weren't going to go until Monroe needed a bigger piece of the check than the other guy. So I had to go back to the office, get $15,000 in cash, and then I had to negotiate, you know, how they're going to split this thing. And finally, I think it was 8 and 7 or something like that. And the guy was a blind banjo picker. What the hell was his name? A very nice guy. Monroe was ugly as sin. I mean, he was probably loaded, I don't know. But he says, and I don't know who the hell called me the father of bluegrass and the Bluegrass Boys. I'm no father of bluegrass. I don't have any band called the Bluegrass Boys. It was right there in print. You know, he must have been really whacked. So the other guy goes out and he plays a fine set, and Monroe plays a pretty good set. Monroe comes back maybe 5 or 6 years later. I'm on duty that night for some unlucky reason. Can't get Monroe out of the bus. Opening act is not this other group this time. So they send me back there. I send myself back there, I guess. And I knock on the bus, and the driver is not in the bus, but he's somewhere around. He sees me, hears me knocking on the bus. He says, who are you? I told him who I was, and I said, I got to get Bill Monroe out here. He's supposed to be on stage. The intermission was long since over. So he opens the door for me with a little button or a key or whatever the hell he had. And I go in there, and Monroe is, so I'm, you know, Mr. Monroe, you know, what do you want? He's a big guy, big, tall. Finally, I get him upright and get him off the steps of the bus, and I realize this guy's shot. I mean, he is, I don't know if he's drunk or drugged, stoned or what, but he ain't too mobile. But somehow I get under him, and the driver gets on the other side, and we walk him up the VOM on the stage right, and we get to the bottom step, and I'm thinking, oh man, I don't know what I'm going to do, because I can't lift this guy up, and if he gets there, what's he going to do anyway? And the band is there, and they're starting to pick, and they started to pick something that was really some standard of his, I guess. And all of a sudden, he just straightened right up, and he stepped up to that step, and he got on that stage, and he started picking that mandolin, and he went on for about an hour and a half with a phenomenal concert. And I don't know how the hell he did it. I mean, it was one of those things that you just marvel at, you know?
Were you there the night Chuck Berry invited half of Chautauqua Amphitheater to come on the stage?
Yeah.
Tell me about that. I was there, and it ended. The concert ended, and Dan kind of called it off. Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, first of all, he wasn't here at the beginning of the concert, you know, and he had a band, of course, and it was there, and they were all there and warming up and playing, and no Chuck Berry. And finally, we got a call from this gate right up here, the north gate, and the guard on the north gate said, "There's a guy coming through the gate in a red Cadillac convertible with a blonde, and he wants to know where the amphitheater is," and I just pointed down that direction. And so they sent a police car to try to find him, to figure that had to be him, and it was. And he shows up about 10 minutes later, backs the damn thing up to the back of the amphitheater. I mean, like it was a truck, like at the loading dock there. Backs the thing up, gets out. I don't know where the blonde went. And he comes around, he jumps up on the stage and starts warming up and playing. And he played like hell. Well, then I don't know what the heck. He played a pretty short set. Seemed to me it was like 45 minutes. He was supposed to be there for an hour and a half, or usually they were 75 or 90-minute contracts, so probably 75 in his case. And it was way short. And then, I don't know which piece he was playing, but all of a sudden he said, y'all come up and dance and stuff like that. And he got the whole damn thing set up, everybody up on stage. He ran out the back. The blonde was in the convertible. She knew something was going on. He jumped off the back of the loading dock onto the back of that Cadillac and into the seat like he was a cowboy mounting a horse in a Western. And he was gone, just like a shot. I mean, never to be seen again. Oh, it had to be 91, 90, 91.
Yeah, it sounds about right.
89 maybe.
It was a wild scene. I remember Dan kind of, trying to get everybody.
Oh yeah, Dan was panicking. He was trying to get everybody off the stage, and Barry just did that as, I think, camouflage to get him off the stage, get himself off the stage. Because he came, I was standing in the back on the porch, and he comes running out, jumps in the damn car like he's got his pants on fire and takes off. It was really, really something.
Well, it was effective exit. That worked.
We had Glenn Campbell. I remember he short-sheeted us on a show one time, and I'm back there yelling. He sort of did the same thing, although he didn't invite the audience to block it so he could do it. He just left. And I'm yelling, Mr. Campbell, you got 20 minutes left on your contract. And he just, well, that's the only time I think we ever got money back. I was so mad. I called that agent the next day and I said, this is baloney. I said, we paid whatever the hell.
Why do I think that's not what you said?
That's not what he said.
We got some money back on that one. But we had some fun.
Were there other guys that just were hard to get on the stage? I've talked to Keith a little bit, Keith Schmidt, some of the backstage acts that just simply were recalcitrant or whatever. It seemed like forever they'd never get them on stage. Did you find yourself have to intervene?
Yeah, the first year, Bob Hess had this cockamamie idea we're going to do off-season programming. So when the season was over, had a series of concerts on, I think Saturday nights down into September, into mid-September. Well, you know how cold it can get and miserable. And one of them was Ben Vereen. And we sold maybe 1,500 tickets or something like that. It was pretty pathetic. So he's there. I'm on duty that night. It was my own damn fault. When I got here, I had that Navy background, and I said to Hess, I said, we ought to have duty officers every night, and rotate it. Charlie, you thank me for that. All those times you had be on patrol. And that's when it started. Bob said, that's a great idea. And so we'd take turns as senior staff being on duty. Well, I was on duty that night, and he had a warm-up act, I guess, or he had a band, I guess, and he's not coming out of the dressing room. And I'm back there with his road manager. And I'm pacing, and I'm saying to this guy, that was supposed to start 8 o'clock, and by now it's about 25 of 9. And I said, they're getting real sick, and you could hear them going, how they go when they get impatient, stuff like that, and stomping on the boards and whatnot. And he comes back and he said, well, he'll be out in a minute, sir. And about 5 minutes later, I said, go talk to him again. He said, well, he's praying. I said, praying? You go back in there and tell that MF to pray fast and get out there. And he knew I was pretty pissed, and I had the check, so it had to be some performance for it. So he came out and did a pretty good show, actually. But some of the lecturers, were kind of difficult to get off. I remember my first year. What the hell was his name, Jan? Buster Crabbe. Yeah, Kevin's senior moment. Buster Crabbe. Was anybody here for that? Buster Crabbe. Anybody remember that?
Is that when he did his push-ups?
Yeah. Buster Crabbe was a former Tarzan in the movies, and a Flash Gordon, I think, was his real claim to fame. But he was also, I get him mixed up with Johnny Weissmuller, but he was quite an athlete in his day, apparently, and maybe a marathon swimmer or something like that. So he was here on a week on senior fitness, physical fitness, and he was going to tell people how he had aged so well into his, I guess he would have been probably in his mid-70s then, or maybe 80. So he comes up from the Wensley House with Winnie, and when I saw him in a tracksuit, I knew I was in trouble. I thought, oh boy, I'd never seen a lecturer show up in a tracksuit before. And so we introduce, and I do the introduction. I read the introduction, which usually came from the program office. Once in a while, I'd gin them up myself, but usually you didn't have time to do the research and stuff, and they did a fairly good job. So I make this 2-minute introduction, whatever they are, and he said, well, Joe, he's given my speech for me. Basically, I don't have much to add to that. What the hell? I mean, no, it's 10 minutes of 11. So I said, well, talk about your lifestyle and all this stuff. So he talks for a couple minutes, and then he's done, ready for questions. I said, wait a minute, let's talk about your movie career and stuff like, and your Tarzan, your Flash. Well, that was good for about another 5 minutes or something like that. And I said, well, Mr. Crabbe, now it's 11 o'clock, not even 11 o'clock, I think it's 5 of, something like that. I said, Mr. Crabbe, can we embellish a little bit on the earlier part, because this is a week on senior health matters and that sort of thing. And that's when he gets down on the stage and starts doing push-ups. Where's the cane? Where's the hook? Well, thank you very much, Mr. Crabbe. I was just devastated. I mean, I'm brand new here. I've been here about a month. It's a month into my first season. I've been there since February. And it's maybe my second lecture moderation. I just feel terrible. And first person I see when I'm walking back, and I kind of hang back because I don't want to see anybody, and walking back to the office, and first person I see, comes up, that's the worst damn lecture this place has ever had. I should get my money back, and blah, blah, blah. Yes, sir, thank you. I don't know. What can you say? I bet the next 10 people that I saw said, I felt so bad for you. They came up, put their arms around me, said, you did the best you could. You didn't have much to work for. The other really weird one I had this guy who was the head of the Iowa Writers Workshop, and he was a novelist, and I forget what the hell his name, he wasn't anybody you'd probably ever heard of unless you're a writer. And he got up there, I introduced him, and he had his book. And he opened his book, and he never looked up. Not one time looked up. Now, there probably were only 800 or 900 people to start with. In those days, we didn't get the 2,000 and 3,000 crowds that we do now. At 12 o'clock, I finally step up to him and say, you know, I figure there's no point in Q&A. Guys just read this damn book. Finally looked up, there were about 50 people left in the place. I mean, I'm watching these people go out through the whole thing. I'm dying. I didn't book them. I don't know.
How do you write a book? Do you think about writing a book? I mean, this is really quite remarkable stuff. Did you find that, just from an administration viewpoint, you worked with Bob Hess, you worked with Dan Bratton, Tom Becker. Were you with Tom when he was president? Mm-hmm. And some guy in between. Did you, as you were going through all that, did you notice significant changes in direction, or was that board driven? Was it presidential driven, or was it to find chairmen of the board sort of driving policy direction?
Well, Dick Miller was chairman when Bob Hess was here, so there's no question that there was direction coming from the board. I mean, he was a very strong chairman, and of course Bob was a very strong president. But you know what? Come to think of it, the last couple of years of Bob Hess's was Howard Gibbs. That's right. Dick Miller had stepped down because he was going through a divorce. That's right. And I forget. Yeah, that's right. That's the first time we circled the wagons. Bob Hess called us all in, all the senior staff. Oh, I just got a call. Chairman Miller is going through a divorce. What are we going to do? You know, what the hell? What do we have to do? The guy's got a personal life. There's nothing we have to say about it. I mean, it was crazy. We had probably 3 staff meetings about his divorce and what it meant to Chautauqua. It didn't mean anything, except he did end up stepping down. That's right. So Howard Gibbs came on. Well, he hated Bob Hess, and Hess hated him. So Hess really drove the boat in those days, and there was just this all the time. Dan came, and Dan, who was chairman then? Howard, I guess. Yeah, Howard was chairman for a while. He was not a particularly strong chairman, but he was a good Chautauqua guy. I mean, he understood Chautauqua and certainly cared very much about the place. And then David Faust came along, and he was a strong, personable, business-like chairman. And then Tom Bromley came along, and that's when we went in the soup for about $500,000 one year on the top of a couple $100,000 the year before. And Bromley called us all in and said, that's not going to happen again. That is not going to happen again. And Dan had gotten pretty loosey-goosey and was more enjoying the, being the president than being the president rather than being president. And so that's when we had this come to Jesus with ourselves, and then with our artistic directors, which is where the problem was. You know, the money was just leaking out of every artistic department. And, opera was losing hundreds of thousands in the orchestra and everywhere. So we brought them all in, or actually Dan and I went out and visited them in their places of work and said, you're either going to bring that in under budget next year or you're not going to be here the following year. And that's just it, period. I don't care who your friends are, how many rich people you know on the board or on the campus. You're not going to do this again. And we turned it around from, I think, a negative $500,000 to a positive $750,000 in 1 year. That was definitely Tom Bromley driven. He was a real tough businessman, and he didn't want that happening on his watch again. And then from then on, we were pretty good. I mean, we might go down a little bit, but we built up a surplus and a cash flow, and we built up a discipline in terms of our capital budget, spending our depreciation to keep the buildings up. Although looking around this building, I'm wondering if it couldn't use a little TLC, Charlie. Looking a little ragged around the edges here. But so, I don't know. Bill Klinger was a great. He wasn't much involved in operations. Didn't much care about that. but boy, he sure understood governance and leadership. And he was the guy that, you know, bit the bullet and got rid of the guy whose name we can't mention, AKA shit for brains.
Was Klinger part of that too? Was he was chairman for a while, wasn't he, Bill?
6 years, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, but he's the one that fired him. He told him this doesn't work. There's a lesson in that, you know.
Timing is unbelievable.
You know, having gone from working for an institution where you get your hand out all the time to working for an institution where other people have their hand out, I realized what a mistake anybody would make in hiring a foundation executive thinking they could raise money. Because if you spend your life, like I have the last 10 years, having people kissing your patoot for money, what would ever make you think you could raise money? Mm-hmm. You know, and that's what, somehow they had this misapprehension that this guy could raise money. He never raised a dime in his life. I actually had one friend that gave $10,000, but he never raised a nickel. And that's a real good lesson for anybody that's involved in nonprofits. Don't go look into the foundations for money raisers. They're money givers. And
if you paused and said, Greg, you were at Chautauqua Institution for, what, 23 years, and they had to write up a little bit about Joe Johnson's biggest legacy to Chautauqua Institution during those 23 years. What would you want them to say?
Tom Becker. I was probably a key to Tom Becker coming here in 1985. In one miserable winter weekend when he and Jane came to visit. Now, Dan and I had interviewed him over the phone three times maybe by then. And they came in the coldest, miserablest weekend in that January. And Jan and I hosted them and convinced them that this was a one-off and never seen it this cold since 1822, and got very close to Tom, you know, in a short period of time. Became, you know, obviously realized we could be good colleagues, and Dan, of course, was key to that too, and prevailed upon a good friend of mine to give Jane a job, which would make the pot sweeter. And I really take a lot of credit for Tom Becker being here to this day. So that, and you know, some fiscal discipline, just to, you know, I think being involved in hiring some really strong folks that have been around, Marty, Ross McKenzie, MT before Marty. You know, we had Charlie, Jack Folker, not Dick. Dick preceded me, but.
Were there, I'm not sure I really know much about, you were around when Dan was hired?
Oh yeah.
What was that process?
Well, I was sort of the acting actor, if you want to call it. They didn't want to name an interim, so they made three of us vice president: Smith, Tom Smith, myself, and Dick Reddington. And then they made me first among equals. So I was like the acting something, I don't know. I was the guy where the buck stopped for that 9 months or so leading up to that. That process was pretty secret. It was, I think, a 7-member committee, I think all board members. And never saw Dan until the day he started here.
Was that a tough thing from where he came from? He was a college president, and then all of a sudden has this is a different animal.
Oh, it was real. I think it was very difficult for Dan. Not only that, unbeknownst to most people, he'd been unemployed for about 6 months. He'd been out there at that college, but he hadn't been he'd been on the payroll, but he hadn't been working. He'd been fired, and it was kind of a surprise, I think. I don't even know if the search committee really actually understood that. But it took Dan a while. But he had the people skills. I won't say charisma, because he wasn't a charismatic guy. I remember walking across the plaza with him many a time, and I'd hit him like that, and I said, Dan, look up and smile and say hi. And here comes somebody down there you should say hi to. Oh, yeah, yeah. And he wasn't real good at that, you know. I think he got better over time, but we had to really push him on it. But then he became a darn good leader and a pretty fearless one, you know, as time went on. But, you know, he was a rinky-dink college, you know, it wasn't much. Kansas Wesleyan. They play basketball?
Do you miss it?
Dan, yeah. Miss it? This?
Well, do you miss Chautauqua?
No.
No?
No. I turned the page. I adjusted. I went into full retirement for almost a year. And when I turned that page, I said it took me about 20 minutes to adjust. And then the foundation thing came along the following year. And that got much busier than I wanted it to for quite a long time. It's tamed back down in the sense that the personal stuff is all gone, the Betty stuff. But now the foundation is much larger, and it's, you know, it's not something that I want to do forever. But no, I don't miss the, you know what I got real sick of were losing summers. I mean, it was great. There was so many great experiences and all the wonderful people you met and all the lectures and stuff I did. That was a magic part of my job, was to be able to be up there and introduce these people and meet such interesting folks. And of course the Soviet experience was beyond belief. I mean, that was, how could you ever put that into a career path? But summer after summer, my kids are growing up, they're coming here for summers, they're working here. Dad, let's go water skiing. Oh, I can't, I gotta go, you know. Let's go down the lake on Sunday. Yeah, but I gotta be back at 5 o'clock for a reception, you know, and that went on. Days, you know, 10 weeks basically without a day off. Sneak one once in a while, but not very often. And then this board, as John probably knows, and Juanita, has an infinite capacity for committees, task forces, and meetings. And I figured out one time that you gave up 16 weekends a year, including the summer, to work here as a senior staff member. That's a lot of time out of your life, you know, 16 weekends. That's a third of the weekends you have in a year, basically. So that kind of wore thin after 23. Wasn't a quick study. It took 23 years to figure it out.
I know I know periodically, if not weekly, you meet with the Charlie Hineses of the world and Dick Reddingtons and Stan Marshhouses to kind of reflect and just bullshit. Do you have a message for, as you guys are, I don't want you to be the spokesperson, but you got Chautauqua, that's so much part of your resume. Is there a message to this community that says, as they look forward to the next 10, 15 years, you know, to be mindful of?
I don't know the message to the community. I got a message to the board, if anybody would listen. Get some local people on this board. They have not one Jamestown person. They're coming to us for millions of dollars. Not one person. They got Bob Metzgar in Warren. Nobody in Jamestown knows him, and hardly anybody in Warren. They have forgotten. I mean, I think the board is thinks they're bigger than they are, or should be. And don't forget your local support. I mean, you know, we were very, very aware of that. I mean, I was involved in recruiting, you know, Paul Sandberg and Betty LeNay and Jack Norden and a whole bunch of local people to the board. Well,
Cindy Peterson.
Cindy Peterson. And there's nobody. And I've talked to Tom about it, but I'm not sure Tom can deliver the message. That's not you guys, except you talk to board members, and you ought to say, hey, who's from Jamestown? Who's from Westfield? Who's from Dunkirk or Fredonia? There's a great community over there that really that no connection with. Bradford, we used to have Bromley, and there was somebody else from Bradford. Warren, now you do have Metzgar, but I don't think he's very well integrated. He's so far above the community financially, and I don't think he's known too well, except maybe at the country club, but, well, that counts, but, so.
So give me your best, as we conclude, give me your best Charlie Hines story.
Did he work here? I can't talk about Charlie. He just had a great working relationship for all those years. You were on the board when I came on, weren't you?
Briefly, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, before you had a perceived conflict with the development?
When I started building stuff, then I was after. Yeah, that was maybe a year or two, but it was during those last years of Bob Hess and the fight with Howard Gibbs and the whole split on the board, and it wasn't any fun.
Charlie can do 2 or 3 see-throughs and still speak English, I'll tell you that.
Were there, without naming names, that's not unlike you, but you have so many stakeholders. That's one place Chautauqua has is a lot of type A personalities. Was there a couple that just simply got to you? You didn't want to see them walking down the path? Again, you don't have to name names.
Well, yeah, there were always a few, because some Chautauquans get so wrapped up in their little world. I always used to say there's about 19 cars on this train, from the golf club association to the women's club to the Twigs and Tweeters to you name it. And whoever was in charge of, and Lou gives me that look, because one time I said Twigs and Tweeters from the platform, and I got about three hate letters about it after that. Show a little respect. Well, that's what everybody calls them. But some of them take that role, whether it's the Alumni Association, or the Art Association, or CLSC.
If anybody gets the big picture, it's Joe Johnson. Ladies and gentlemen, Joe, thank you very much.
Thank you. Now you get your snipper out and cut out all.